Hi, and welcome to me doing my best to review Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. So I took this book overseas with me and I read it while traveling. It was a great book to read while traveling, by the way. And I finished it a while ago and I've brought it back to Australia. It's going on my bookshelf with the other Vernes I've got. I've been delaying this review because I kind of fundamentally doubt my ability to do justice to it. There's a lot happening here in lots of different ways. Okay, let's start with what I've got. I've got a Penguin Classics edition. It's translated from the French with notes that are very useful. The notes are very, very useful, by Michael Gencross, of whom I know nothing. And there's an introduction by Brian Aldiss. Of course, Brian Aldiss, science fiction. I like Aldiss. It's a great introduction in which Aldiss lauds, I suppose, Jules Verne as the father of science fiction, which he's been called a few times around the traps. My cover has detail from The Ride on the Elephant, Fog in Relative Comfort, Passepartout Somewhat Unhappy, original illustration by Al Bennett for Around the World in 80 Days, 1873 edition. The photo of which was taken by Mary Evans Picture Library. Anyway, it's a good edition. The notes are very useful and the introduction gives a lot of information about it. So I was under the strong, but I suspect now mistaken impression that I've actually read Around the World in 80 Days. I do like Verne. I reread 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea last year. Enjoyed it, though I don't think that translation was as good as this one. It almost trivialized the book. It didn't seem to have the richness that I seem to remember from that book, which I'd read before. The year before that, I read another Verne. I think it was, yes, Journey to the Center of the Earth. Again, excellent. That was a good translation. Sadly, it was a library book. I don't own it anymore. And one thing that I learnt from reading Aldiss's introduction is that since Verne originally wrote in French, a lot of the translations that have happened over the years tended to make them translations basic. So apparently in many countries, which I didn't know, Verne is largely seen as a children's writer because these adventures are for children. I never saw him that way. I'm guessing that my parents read more adult translations. Okay, so Verne was a serial writer. Actually quite an interesting story to him and his life. He was initially, by his family, wanted him to become a lawyer of some kind. In the 1800s, they sent him off to learn law. And he's played around with that for a while, but his heart was always in writing. And in 1862, according to the notes of the chronology, he met publisher Pierre-Jules Herzl and offered him a manuscript that he'd written, and that was the trigger for a long association between Herzl's son, and Verne writing a large number of books for them. Most of this was serialized and described as the Amazing Journeys, I think. Amazing Journeys. So you had rafts and you had balloons and you had a whole heap of other things. Now, if you accept the Jules Verne's books, the first of which was 5 Weeks in a Balloon, as the Amazing Journeys series, then this is, I think, number 11 in the series. I don't think that matters. I think that each one of them is a standalone, and the fact that they were published with sort of almost serialization for the 1800s is irrespective to one's enjoyment of the individual books, because they are aimed at being individual books. However, they were not written as individual books. They were serialized. And so Around the World in 80 Days appeared in a journal whose name I can neither remember nor pronounce, since I don't speak French, which has been exceptionally obvious after traveling in Switzerland, where many people do. So because it was serialized, I suspect that the writing was patchy and my reading was patchy. The first third I had issues with. By around the halfway mark, I was fully invested, and in the last third, I was enjoying the hell out of it. But there are issues to the writing. that I experienced. And before I get into it, so basically, my mistake in thinking that I'd read it before, I think, comes from the fact that I watched the 1974 70s cartoon when I was quite young, and I've always had that story in the head, complete with Passepartout being a completely comedic figure. He's slightly comedic in the book, but not excessively so. And along with an image of Phileas Fogg that was entirely inconsistent with what you've got in the book. So, in the cartoon, he was doing it in order to marry a woman. But in the book, we've got a very different scenario. So we've got Phileas Fogg, who's an entirely wealthy English gentleman. He lives a solitary life. He's got a manservant to help him. At the beginning of the book, he's just fired his manservant for serving his shaving water at the wrong temperature, because he's that sort of a man. He interviews and immediately hires a Frenchman, Jean Passepartout, as a replacement, and then walks off to the club where he goes every day, mainly to play whist, but also to dine. So in many respects, you've got an 1800s scenario right there. It's like the idea of an English gentleman living at home but always dining in the club, for example, is alien to the 2020s way of seeing things. There's a lot of history then. If you like reading historical settings, I think you're going to have a lot of fun with Around the World in 80 Days for a whole heap of reasons. Once Phileas Fogg gets to the club, he mostly spends most of his time in. He's playing whist, and with whatever the whist is, it's got to do with cards, I gather. Never played it. I feel that my life choices in this regard may not be bad. So Phileas accepts a wager. And the wager is for £20,000, which is a fortune then. It's probably a fortune now, but it's half his fortune. And he accepts this wager from fellow club members about how long it will take to travel around the world. Phileas Fogg believes it will take 80 days or less, and he makes up a very careful itinerary which he tries to follow. Of course, in the book, many things go wrong. Now, the reason Phileas knows this is because he's described as this almost automaton. He's this completely unemotional, clockwork-like figure. And this is where my initial problem with the book crept in. And it's that Phileas Fogg is clearly a stereotype and a mockery of Englishmen. It becomes very clear very early on that Vern loathed the English to an extent that, and I mean, we all know, right, that the English and the French, they've got that thing happening where they didn't always like each other and they insult each other a little bit, but this isn't a little bit, this is huge. It's the level of mockery that he has for English gentlemen, and I'm not saying they didn't deserve it in the 1800s. I've never met an English gentleman from the 1800s, but the level of mockery is quite abusive, and it makes one not able to sympathise with the author and not like him very much. It also makes it hard to like the book initially. A few other quirks in terms of Vern's writing. Obviously, the 1800s, he's imperialistic, he's racist. Any brown-skinned member of the world is lesser than the white European, though clearly the French white Europeans are better than the English white Europeans, but they're all still better than anyone with brown skin. You're either going to be able to live with it or you aren't. I had hitches with it here and then. So he's imperialist, he's colonialist, he's violently anti-English and quite nasty about that at times. And with all that, it's still a wonderful adventure story. So it describes the world, travel around the world, and if you go to Wikipedia, you've actually got a map that describes the traverse. He starts from London, and there's a lot in the introduction by Aldiss which talks about how that had become possible and comparing it with what it would be possible to travel around the world today. I've virtually traveled around the world recently. It took me about 20 hours. Obviously not 80 days. So Phileas Fogg and Passepartout leave London. They go down to Suez. The Suez Canal was one of the new things that allowed faster travel between Europe and the Antipodes. and they catch a boat. They go to India. In India, a major digression happens in that they are drawn into having missed their train. I think they missed their train. Phileas Fogg ends up buying an elephant and a mahout to transport him and Passepartout across the continent. And with them is being transported an English army person, or was it an army person, or was it an India company person? Anyway, a local Englishman, as it were. As they're transported across, they see all these people in a procession, and Phileas Fogg and Passepartout come to understand that they're witnessing a suttee, a woman who's being forcibly drugged with hashish and other things in order to be burnt on the pyre with her dead husband. They then intervene, they rescue the woman, who thereafter is known as Miss Sauda, and she accompanies them for the rest of their journey. Having left India, they then travel down through, I think, what we'd call Indonesia and Singapore these days, up to Hong Kong, across to Japan, where they catch a ferry to America. They cover America mostly by train until the train breaks down and Phileas Fogg has to come up with another solution. They reach the Pacific coast, and then you have massive problems with the ship to get back to England. And there's a bit of a quirk at the ending that I'm not even really going to go into, but the adventure book is fun. And in order to spice things up, you've got Passepartout, who's taken the position of personal assistant, man, whatever, butler, something or other, for Phileas Fogg, because he doesn't like excitement. He finds this situation perfect because the gentleman is so meticulous. He does the same thing every day. You can predict what he wants exactly. That's exactly what Passepartout wants in life. But then Phileas Fogg comes back from the club and says, "Don't pack much, but we're departing immediately for France." And he's kind of horrified. Vern clearly loves Passepartout as much as he loathes Phileas Fogg, his main protagonist. And for most of the novel, he refers to him as the dear fellow, which is, even Brian Aldiss found that a bit naff. So he's constantly lauding how wonderful Passepartout is compared to Phileas Fogg. And in addition to that, we've got the fact that in England, just before the departure, there's been this huge bank robbery, and an English policeman somewhere, was it in France? I can't remember. It was fairly on in the piece, has decided that Phileas Fogg is the bank robber, and this whole trip around the world is a blind. It's got nothing to do with a bet. He's just doing this to escape the authorities. So you've got Detective Fix, chasing them all around while they're in those parts of the world that are under British or Raj rule. He's got this arrest order. Once he gets out of that, he's got an extradition order. He can't get an extradition order, so he sticks to Phileas Fogg and Passepartout like glue, aiming to end back to England with them, and then grab Phileas as soon as he sets foot in England, which he does. So you've got these characters, and you've got this really dynamic adventure story, and I think if you're going to enjoy this book, you're going to enjoy it as an antiquated adventure story. Vern's discussion of all these places around the world is quite wonderful. And the more so since I don't believe Vern ever travelled extensively in his own self. I know he went to England once when he was quite young, and that's probably why he loathes all English. But mostly it seems that he stayed home, he was married, and he just imagined these wonderful journeys and these wonderful places around the world, probably from things he'd read himself. Though I think it's in the introduction that Aldiss talks about how when he was a kid, Jules Verne tried to run away to sea and was taken off the ship and taken home, probably having his ears boxed by his father. So all this is probably a little bit of wish fulfillment in these travels around the world. The writing, I mean, honestly, we don't really know what the writing is, but the translation is delightful. It manages to be mature, even while Vern is making some tough assumptions about other nations. It manages to be mature. I think it manages to catch the era very well. It certainly manages to catch your attention with the characters in question. So Oda and Phileas Fogg end up getting married, and that culminates the plot whereby Phileas Fogg wins the bet even though all things appear to be lost. So you should read it and find out how he does that, because it's a pretty good book. Highlights. I really enjoyed the descriptions of India. I think, having read a fair bit about India, I did quite enjoy that. The procession in which Oda is about to be forced to undergo Suti is... it's not going to be to everyone's taste, obviously, but I did really enjoy it. I like the descriptions of India. I like the descriptions of train travel and the mix of nationalities that's described for India is quite intriguing. What else? Passepartout gets separated from Phileas and Oda a bit later. I think that happens... Is it in Hong Kong? Yes, it's in Hong Kong. So at this point, Passepartout and Detective Fix have been the best of friends on the streamers. Fix was trying to get into Passepartout's good graces and discover if he's in league with the bank robber who is his master or not. At this point, Passepartout is taken into Fix's confidence after 2 bottles of port. And can I just say, how much does that date the book? It's like 2 men drinking 2 bottles of port in an opium den in the middle of the day. Anyway, Passepartout isn't having a bar of it, so Fix actually drugs him and separates him from his master, leaves him drugged with opium and full of port in an opium den. Passepartout still manages to catch the steamer to Yokohama, which he just booked on, but he doesn't succeed in getting back to the hotel to warn his master, Phileas Fogg, that the Yokohama is living at a different time. So he actually arrives in the next port of call, Yokohama, ahead of Fogg and Oda. And there's this weird sequence where Passepartout, we've been told, was a acrobat in one of his previous jobs. And this weird sequence of him wandering around Japan, it's a sequence that makes no sense. And the Japan in which he's portrayed doesn't make a lot of sense either. He decides that his European garb will make him stand out, so he exchanges his more expensive European garb for some real low-quality Japanese clothes, and then he decides he can't do anything with that. And then he joins a circus, and while he's performing, he notices Fogg and Oda in the crowd, and he takes off from the middle of the stage to chase after them. It's a bizarre sequence. The Japanese sequence is pretty much the one that makes me feel like when he was filling out that Vern didn't know much about the country and didn't really care. It's like he almost just wanted to get it written and out of the way. However, after that, they end up in New York. At this stage, we've got Fix still following Fogg, and Passepartout now knows that Fix is actually not what he claims. And from then on, the dynamic changes a little bit. I could probably ramble on about this a great deal more. It was a good book. I would very much like to read anything more by Vern that's translated by Michael Gencross. I might look out for them especially, because the maturity and the depth of the writing actually makes this book more enjoyable. It's a slow read though. It's one of those books where the chapters are like 1, 2, 3 and you're done with the chapter. The chapters' titles are that cute old thing that they used to do where each chapter tell you what's happened. So chapter 9 is Where the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean Prove Favourable to Phileas Fogg's Purposes. It's a great book. It's fun. I'll kind of agree with the father of science fiction on the basis of Journey to the Centre of the Earth and some of the other books he wrote. This doesn't feel particularly science fiction, but it does feel adventure-y and early enough to be the gap between complete normalized fiction and science fiction. Thank you very much for listening to me ramble on about this book at length. I wanted to get it done while it was still fairly fresh in my mind, and I do recommend that if anything I said sounds intriguing, or if you do want to discover the really early writers who are credited with being the fathers or mothers or great-grandparents or whatever of science fiction, I would recommend Vern. Thank you for watching algorithm stuff, but comment if you've read it. I'd love to hear your impression. Comment if you remember the 1974 comic as cartoon as well. I remember it being really, really good, but the level to which it's based on this book is purely ephemeral. It's really completely different. Phileas Fogg is a very sympathetic, amusing, genteel yet engaging character instead of the complete automaton with no emotions that is portrayed here. And yeah, thanks for watching. See ya.